Hello, and you're very welcome to another edition of AgriFocus. It's been said that there are only two things in life which are certain, death and taxes. And today we're going to be taking a closer look at a certain tax which for many farmers is a real headache, value-added tax. I'm Frances McDonald, and joining me today is Marty Murphy, Head of Tax with IFAC, which has an expert team of accountants and financial advisors across the country. Marty, Revenue has just published new guidance on the special scheme for farmers who are not registered or required to register for VAT, typically known as flat rate farmers. We've been waiting for this new guidance from Revenue on the VAT refund order for flat rate farmers since the beginning of the year. So who is eligible for a VAT refund under the refund order, and is it specifically only allowed on certain expenditure?
So who would be eligible is technically your typical farmer that isn't registered for VAT or anything like that has a herd number, that's actively involved in farming or selling cattle, selling tillage, whatever they're kind of doing on a day-to-day basis, provided they've no other obligation. Now, the tillage farmers to a certain extent would be registered, but the likes of our dairy farmers and things like that are basically our beef farmers, etc. They're all going to be eligible for refunds depending on what they're doing. And what it's far more of, it's not to be giving you a refund on your day-to-day basis. So what happens around VAT for farmers is we have what we call the flat rate, and how effectively it works is, rather than getting every farmer in the country to go in and have to actually register for VAT, which would be a huge amount of paperwork for absolutely everybody involved and a huge cost to everybody. What the government managed to do back in 1972, which is a long time ago now, but they came up with a degradation for farmers where effectively, instead of doing that, when they sell their animals, when they sell their crops, when they sell their milk and things like that, they get a little add-on to the price. So if I sold my cow for €1,000, and I know I'm not selling a cow any day soon for €1,000, but if I sold it for €1,000, I get a little bit of VAT added onto that to give back to me personally, to give me compensation for my input costs of when I actually raise that cow. So if I'm going out and I'm buying feed or things like that, or if I'm buying fertilizer in particular that I'm paying VAT on, that instead of me actually going back to the revenue man and getting a refund on it, I'm getting compensation at the point of sale. Okay, now that's all great, and that works for our day-to-day costs for our diesel and all that type of different good stuff, etc. But if I'm in a situation where actually I'm going to do a major investment, I'm going to run a project, I'm going to do something that wouldn't be a normal and a typical business would regard it as capital expenditure, well, then I start to look at what we call this VAT 58, which is a refund where I'm investing on fixed capital items such as buildings, such as the installations that goes into those buildings, kind of the things that I expect to last long term, that aren't going to be just for that couple of months until I run out of it and I go out and buy it again. It's going to be something that I'm expecting to be fixed and lasting for multiple years. So buildings being the perfect example of it.
So it's vital infrastructure really on the farm.
It's vital infrastructure on the farm. Now, it doesn't apply to, like some people will point out, that your house, for instance, it doesn't apply to your house. It has to actually be something that's used on the farm. So if I'm building a farmhouse, I'm not getting the VAT back on it. But if I'm building a slatted shed beside the farmhouse, I am getting the VAT back on that.
So there's three specific areas that this applies to, isn't there?
There is. There's the constructions and extensions, there's the fencing, and there's basically the construction and erection of qualifying equipments and things like that. Anything that's basically been fixed in place. And it boils down to those three areas. The ones that in reality has been the kind of the most controversial, where most of the emphasis has been put into, is any equipment that's been basically going into the predefined structures and things like that, along with what is an actual freestanding structure and things like that. So as we could have seen over the last couple of months in the various debates and the questions that were being asked across, things like basically sturdy silos that could be a couple of acres in size, a couple of times the size of an Olympic swimming pool, where to a certain extent it was argued whether or not they could be movable. Now, within the document that's been published, we can now see that they are in fact now allowable for VAT refunds and all that type of good stuff. So we will be getting a refund on those. But that's kind of the areas that we've been looking at.
Yeah, and Revenue's been very clear that they see farm buildings that are affixed to or in the ground, and as you say, can't be dismantled or moved.
Yes, and they've throughout the document, there's a word that keeps popping up everywhere that they seem to have loved, and it seems to be anything made of concrete they're very much willing to allow. And as long as it's made of concrete and stuck in the ground, cannot be movable, it's mentioned as being refundable within the document.
And they're saying pretty much the same thing when it comes to farming structures, aren't they?
They are, but they pointed us a number of months ago to what we call the 13B VAT directive on what is allowable and not allowable, and structures and buildings is what's very much within the VAT 58, but it doesn't form within the other document. So we do have this kind of thing of Are they referring to structures as constructions, which means does it have to be made of concrete? But then revenue are coming back and kind of reinforcing this contract point. So there's a little bit of disparity that we weren't sure of, that this document is giving more examples of where they're coming to it from, which means we can kind of figure out from what they've now told us what they will be allowing and won't be allowing.
Yeah, because when we go back to look at what farm buildings cover now, they're specifically saying it's barns, lean-to sheds, this type of thing, cow, calf sheds. So there is that specific area, isn't there?
There's a specific area to it, and their key point is they don't want you to be able to move it, and the more stuck in the ground it is, the more likely it is to be allowable. So provided it isn't a plastic shed that I can tow away in the morning, their document is reinforcing the point that you'll get the VAT back on it. But if it is something that's movable or movable to a certain extent, that they won't be allowing it.
And in relation to farm structures now, they've definitely showed us that cattle grids, concrete paths adjacent to farm buildings, farm roads and silage pits are now also, that's defined within this.
It's defined within, which is a useful point moving on for us, because before there was a question mark over them, and it's like everything else, it's to have that clarity which we've been missing for so long that we can now be advising. As little as a couple of days ago, if you came into one of our offices and you brought out the list of the improvements that you're making on their farm, what we would be saying to you is you can't budget it in that you're definitely going to be getting anything back on any of this stuff, because we could list out submissions where they're rejected. But now we have a situation where we know what's allowable, we know what's not allowable, and we can very clearly go, well, this is white, this is grey, this is black, and there's going to be a huge amount of grey area within it, and there will be over the next couple of months. But again, we understand where revenue is now coming from, and we can start to challenge them to a certain extent on their document as they've produced it.
We've been covering here in Agriland that some of the farming organisations are not exactly happy with what revenue has published in this update, and particularly around the issues of like silo feed and meal bins. Because several of farm organisations have said they've disappointed because of where the guidance has gone on this.
Absolutely, because we're seeing what is in water troughs, where they particularly make the point that if it's made of concrete, it's allowable, but if it's made of plastic, it's not allowable. So there's a certain level of why is that not? But again, it'll be to flesh it out over the next couple of months. Like, this is the first document that revenue has pointed out. It's the first time we actually have a clear view of what they are allowing, what they're looking for, and everything else. And effectively, this all comes from a year and a half ago now, where we started to see the first rejections really coming through, and we ended up in a little bit of a mystery area for a number of months of we didn't have anything. So we welcome anything from revenue so that we can see insights to what they're looking at. Is it perfect? Is it definitely everything in it is the greatest thing ever? No way intact. Like, I represent the farmers at the end of the day, and my own view is anything with VAT on it should be refundable back to them. Why we're suffering any level of VAT shouldn't be allowed, but then it becomes the line of, do we all want to go registering for VAT? So there's going to be lines and levels and everything else to it, and I can understand why there's a level of frustration there.
Yeah. Before this guidance document was published, and you were saying there, we've seen this kind of filtering through for the last few months, there must have been then farmers who were very much confused about what was going on.
There was a huge amount of confusion. Like, at the end of the day, if you're talking about building out the developments, and you're putting 200,000 or 300,000 euros on the line, and you're expecting to be getting a certain amount of money that could be 20,000, 30,000 euros back, and suddenly it disappears into abyss, it's hard to budget that. And we're in this time where we had a great 22, 23 was hard, and 24 looks like it's going to be hard to a certain level as well in restricting times. We also had, I mentioned the flat rate addition there. That's been reduced in the Irish budget every year for the last 5 years. And I commented it as well this year again. So it's more money coming out of a farmer's pocket. And to be in a situation where you are, yes, I want to go and I want to invest in an enterprise to actually go out and earn money for the community and help everything else, to be in a situation of uncertainty wasn't helpful. But again, this document is there. At least it's something for us to work off.
Yeah, and I know there were some farmers that we spoke to about this, and they said they were depending on that money coming in. And then suddenly there was a space in the bank account where it should have been.
Absolutely. But it's like everything else. When we go out to develop an infrastructure that's going to last us 30 or 40 years, we want to build the best we can for the budget that we have available to us. And if there's a black hole basically opens up where money doesn't come in to finance that type of thing, it's hard. And it's hard for any business.
If we just go back to some of the more controversial items that have been listed in this guidance, we know that feed and meal bins that qualify for the order have to be those which are, as you say, are permanently installed on a thick concrete base. And claimants have to be able to provide descriptions, don't they, of these, and actually show what they're developing.
Yes, absolutely. Now, we've been asked from revenue to provide pictures, give backgrounds, how it's been used, and all types of detail being provided through to them. But it does also point out that revenue is talking. It's not like we're just making these submissions in and it's just, that's it. It's either yay or nay. There is conversations that are happening back and forth. Revenue in their guidance documents are just saying what they are typically allowing. So there is that kind of area where they like concrete, as I said. It seems to be the key kind of thing. Provided that there's concrete and it's fixed, they will be allowing. But if it's in such a way that you could take it up and sell it on Dunhill in the morning, there's a certain level of, okay, it's not going to be allowable for the purposes of this.
And that's the problem with some feed and meal bins that are described as portable, isn't it?
They're described as portable. As one of my colleagues just said to me before I came in here, if it can be hooked to the back of a tractor and moved somewhere else, it's hard to say it's not portable.
Yeah. And I think one of the other aspects that one of the farm organisations had mentioned is that they haven't defined as such a minimum size for a meal bin that's bolted to a concrete base. So as you say, there is that grey area, isn't there?
There is that grey area, and it's like everything else. Throughout all of life, there's going to be some level of grey area. And do we want it defined or not want it defined? It does come to a certain point as well, because it tends to be the bigger projects and things like that when we're putting in things of whether or not it's going to be allowable. Typically, we're not making these types of claims on a daily basis. So it's like everything else. If it's something that's readily usable and we're expecting it only to last a couple of months, it's likely not going to get a VAT refund on it. If it's going to be something that's going to be there that your grandchild could end up using, it more than likely will be refundable.
Yeah. And I know that we have covered stories about this. Some of the TDs had appealed for slurry bags to be considered, because we are obviously talking about storage on farm, and that's a key issue for us at the moment. But slurry bags and mobile slurry tankers are not included in this?
They're not, because they've been seen as being mobile and all that type of good stuff. And again, they keep using that word concrete. And like I mentioned the silo at the start of this, where we were being told that a slurry silo that I think was 1,000 meters cubed. That's a huge amount. We were being informed that's been mobile. So while we've got the silos through, we haven't got the bags. And the way I would see it is we haven't got the bags yet, because they're getting bigger in size and everything else. Again, what we're seeing within the document is where revenue believes the line is. And it's more work to be done as I see it.
Yeah. And we know that there are some items that many farmers would consider are really fundamental, their day-to-day operations, but they've been left off the list of eligible items, and primarily issues like, cubicle slat mats and automatic calf feeders and robotic scrapers. So what is exactly covered?
What's exactly covered is anything that's bolted down and is traditionally within a shed. Because one of the big things that were kind of highlighted through to us while we've been interacting with the various organisations in revenue is basically anything was in existence from 1972 that would have been typically within a shed should be allowable, but they've allowed certain other things that would outside that scope and all that type of good thing. One of the things they are very clear of is if something can move, it's more than likely isn't going to be allowable. And if we have robots that are kind of to a certain level can actually go out and do autonomous functions and leave that shed and go somewhere else, that revenue at the moment aren't allowing it. But it's like everything else. We keep pushing, we keep showing where the rest of Europe and things and everything else is going, and we kind of see, can we push a little bit harder and further.
So just to be clear, not covered under the VAT refund order are automatic calf feeders, calving cameras, cow brushes, cow collars, egg vending machines, feed bins, excluding silo feed bins, heat and health monitoring systems, milk vending systems, pasteurization tanks, robotic scrapers, security cameras, slurry bags, slurry spreaders, and yard scrapers. So the automatic scraper system and wire root scrapers are allowable though under the order.
They are allowable provided it's bolted in and can't be moved and things like that. So it's kind of like, again, it comes back to the plastic one's not allowed, but the concrete one is allowed. What's the difference within it? And to a certain level is if the scraper can move around by itself rather than being bolted in, what's the difference to a certain extent? But revenue are saying there is a line there.
Yeah. And if we could just very briefly touch on fencing. So what expenditure is allowed there?
So the ultimate thing of it is, and to a certain extent, fencing hasn't been popping up to a large extent because it's been allowed through, but basically gates, fences, everything else, everything you can do to actually put up a fence. Now, if you're buying tools like phase testers to check to see if the fence is working, to actually tighten and tension and all that type of stuff, that's not going to be allowable. If you're planting plants around the fence, that's not going to be allowable. So it's technically anything you actually need to physically leave a fence behind, as in that the fence is going to be there and going to be part of the fence. That is allowable. but anything that's, temporarily used, either erect a fence or decorate around it, that's not going to be allowable. And we've always seen the kind of situation where fencing was a little bit more clearly defined than maybe a lot of the other items were, because again, fencing is kind of typically the standard enough.
Do you think that this makes it easier for Irish farmers now that we have some guidance?
Does it make it easier for Irish farmers? Now, the first thing to point out there is we're unique in Europe in this. Nobody else is doing this. We're being referred to VAT documentation that exists within Europe to see what is basically being done throughout of Europe, but it's not necessarily anywhere else is applying it the same way effectively that we are. Does it help the Irish farmer? Yes, it does. It means that they don't have to file VAT returns. How long that's going to continue on, we don't know. We have seen VAT modernisation project being kicked off by Revenue. We see it coming in the next couple of years. And the reality of it is more than likely our kids will be registered for VAT. We ourselves are it's unlikely, but our kids, when they're farming, will more than likely be registered for VAT.
What advice now is IFAC given to farmers on the back of this new publication?
So basically the advice that we're giving is anybody who's been holding back with VAT 58s and not putting them in over the last while because of what basically the uncertainty is there, is to actually start bringing them into our offices and looking through, because we now have a very set list to a certain extent where we can say, yes, that's definitely going through. Let's put those through. We know the areas that are going to be a little bit grayer, and we know the areas that there's definitely a no-go to a certain extent. So we can provide a lot more clarity. When I've been going around and doing a lot of work on like the various accountant bodies throughout Ireland and talking to local accountants and talking to our own clients and different organisations, one of the things I've been asked for is a definitive list. And while it mightn't be the best list that's ever created, it's still a list. So we have a list to a certain degree that can actually now hand to somebody and go, listen, there is a list there. There is kind of a certainty for these items. There is a grey area, there is a black area, but at least we know where we stand to a certain extent, especially like a shed doesn't get built in the morning. It takes months and months of planning. And we can, it's planning from every side. There's planning permission, there's going in, getting bank money, there's actually saving up our own money and all that type of good stuff. There's agreements between families and partnerships and all that type of stuff. So now there's a certain level more of certainty that definitely didn't exist a week or two ago.
And just for farmers, do you think that they need to be very mindful of that checklist if they are going to be investing on their farm?
Unfortunately, I think they do, because at the end of the day, when you have a differentiation coming in between putting in something of plastic or putting it in of concrete, it does mean you have to be mindful. It's this thing of basically when the builders have come through, you have to go back and through and go, that was described on the plans as a concrete, basically trough. Is it actually made of concrete? Like, that's the reality of it. You're going to have to pay a little bit more attention than like most of us would have time for, but that's the reality of it. Yeah.
So the message to farmers is now get moving, get your refund orders in, make sure that you're on top of it. And is that something, do you find farmers are good at?
They are now. It's typically, most businesses would file a VAT return every 2 months. Farmers have a tendency maybe every 2 years they might put in a VAT 58. So we would always be encouraging to don't let it build up too much. Put it in as quickly and early as possible.
Marty and I can both agree that there's a lot more to come out of the guidance document from Revenue. But for now, I'd like to thank Marty Murphy, Head of Tax with IFAC, for sharing his expertise and knowledge with us today on our AgriFocus podcast. And if you have any comments on how this latest guidance from Revenue might impact on you and your farm, please do get in touch. As always, if you get the chance to rate, review and follow AgriFocus on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from, we would appreciate that. And we look forward to catching up with you again very soon.